I'm Sarah, and I'm 32 years old. For most of my life, I believed my parents were fair people who loved their children equally. I thought the sacrifices I made during college were just part of growing up, part of learning responsibility. I thought my brother Jake's constant failures were just bad luck, and that my parents' endless financial support for him was simply parental love in action. But what happened next shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. What I overheard in that conversation changed not just how I saw my parents, but how I saw my entire childhood, my entire identity, and my entire future. Because sometimes, the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. If you've ever felt like you were the family afterthought, like your achievements meant nothing while someone else's failures were celebrated, then this story is going to hit you hard. But I promise you, it's also going to show you that your worth isn't determined by the people who should have seen it first. Let me take you back to when I was 18, about to start college. I was valedictorian of my high school class, had a partial academic scholarship to State University, and had been working part-time at a local bookstore since I was 16. I was excited about my future, about studying business and maybe getting my MBA someday. My parents seemed proud, at least on the surface. Jake was 16 then, 2 years younger than me, and he was already struggling. He'd barely passed his sophomore year, spent most of his time playing video games, and had zero interest in anything that required effort. But my parents would always make excuses for him. They'd say he was just a late bloomer, that he'd find his passion eventually, that boys mature slower than girls. Even then I noticed things. When I got my scholarship letter, my mom smiled and said that was nice, then immediately started talking about how they needed to help Jake with his history project. When I made honor roll, my dad nodded and mentioned they should probably get Jake a tutor. When I got promoted to shift supervisor at the bookstore, my mom worried that I was working too much and should focus on being a normal teenager like Jake. But I pushed those feelings down. I told myself I was just being sensitive, that of course they loved us both equally, that maybe I was just more naturally driven than Jake, and that was okay. Starting college was harder than I expected, but not academically. The academic part was fine. It was the financial reality that hit me like a truck. My scholarship covered about 60% of my tuition, and my parents made it clear that I'd need to cover the rest, plus my living expenses. They helped me apply for student loans and find a work-study job in the campus library. They said it would be good for me to learn independence, to understand the value of money, to build character. I worked 25 hours a week at the library, took out loans for what I couldn't cover, and lived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. I wore the same 3 pairs of jeans all semester and learned to stretch $1 in ways I never thought possible. When I called home stressed about money, my parents reminded me that this was part of growing up, that I was learning valuable life skills. Meanwhile, Jake was failing his junior year. He'd skip classes, ignore homework, and spend entire days on his gaming setup that my parents had bought him for his birthday. When his grades came out, they were a disaster. My parents hired him a private tutor at $80 per session, twice a week. They bought him organizational planners, noise-canceling headphones for studying, and a new laptop because his old one was supposedly too slow for his assignments. During my sophomore year, Jake barely graduated high school. It was touch and go right until the end, and he only made it because my parents spent thousands on summer school and additional tutoring. I came home for his graduation, exhausted from my final exams and my work schedule, and watched my parents beam with pride as if he'd cured cancer. That fall, Jake started at the local community college. My parents paid his full tuition, bought him a car so he could commute, and gave him a generous monthly allowance so he could focus on his studies without the distraction of working. They said they'd learned from their experience with me that maybe they'd been too harsh in making me work so much. I felt a stab of something I didn't want to name. Here I was, maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working myself to exhaustion, taking out more loans each semester, and they were talking about how they'd been too harsh with me? But I pushed it down. I told myself they were just trying to help Jake succeed, that everyone's path was different. Jake lasted 1 semester at community college before he stopped showing up to classes. He spent his days sleeping until noon, playing games until 3 a.m., and telling my parents he was overwhelmed and needed a break. They were disappointed but understanding. They said he just needed time to figure himself out, that not everyone was cut out for college right away. During my junior year, I was elected to the student government, made the dean's list both semesters, and started an internship at a local marketing firm. I was also working more hours to cover rising costs and had taken on tutoring other students to make ends meet. When I called home excited about my internship, my mom listened for about 2 minutes before telling me about how worried she was about Jake, how he seemed depressed and listless. Jake spent that year living at home, sleeping late, and occasionally talking about maybe trying college again, or maybe learning a trade. My parents paid for him to see a career counselor, bought him books about different career paths, and even paid for him to take a few online courses that he never completed. By my senior year, I was burning out. I was working 30 hours a week, carrying a full course load, and had been accepted into a competitive graduate program that would require me to take out even more loans. I was exhausted, stressed, and starting to feel resentful in ways that scared me. That's when Jake decided to try college again. He enrolled at a different community college, and my parents were thrilled. They paid his tuition again, increased his allowance, and bought him new clothes for his fresh start. They told me they were so proud of him for giving it another try, for not giving up on his dreams. Jake lasted 6 weeks this time. He said the professors were unfair, the workload was too much, and he felt like college just wasn't for him. My parents were disappointed but supportive. They said maybe he was more of a hands-on learner, that college wasn't the only path to success. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business and a minor in psychology. I had job offers from 3 different companies and had been accepted to 2 MBA programs. My parents came to my graduation, took photos, and told me they were proud. Then they spent the drive home talking about how they thought Jake might be interested in becoming an electrician and how they were researching trade schools for him. That summer, while I was working at my first corporate job and saving money for graduate school, Jake decided to try college one more time. "Third time's the charm," my parents said. They enrolled him at the same community college where he'd failed twice before, paid his tuition again, and gave him an even bigger allowance because they said he'd learned from his mistakes. This time, Jake lasted almost a full semester before he stopped attending classes. He said he'd realized that college really wasn't for him, that he was more of an entrepreneur at heart. My parents were disappointed but understanding. They said they were proud of him for trying so hard, for really giving it his all. I was 23, working full-time, and had just been promoted to a junior management position. I was also taking graduate classes at night and paying for them myself. When I told my parents about my promotion, they smiled and said that was nice, then immediately started talking about how they were going to help Jake start his own business. That's when I started keeping track. Not intentionally at first, but I found myself mentally cataloging things. The money my parents had spent on Jake's failed college attempts, approximately $15,000. The money they'd spent on his tutoring, career counseling, and various courses, probably another $8,000. His car, his allowance, his living expenses while he figured himself out, thousands more. The total support they'd given me during college, $0 beyond helping me fill out financial aid forms, but I still tried to rationalize it. I told myself I was stronger, more independent, that I didn't need their help the way Jake did. I told myself that their support of him came from love, not favoritism. I told myself that I was being petty and ungrateful. When I was 25, I got engaged to my college boyfriend, David. We'd been together for 4 years, and he was a wonderful man who saw my worth in ways my family never seemed to. When I told my parents about the engagement, they seemed happy but immediately started talking about costs and budget limitations. They sat me down and explained that they couldn't contribute much to the wedding because they were still helping Jake get on his feet. He was 23 then, living at home, and had just started another business venture that they were funding. They said they could probably manage $2,000 toward the wedding, but that was really stretching their budget. I accepted this, even though it hurt. David and I planned a small, beautiful wedding that we paid for ourselves. My parents' $2,000 contribution covered the flowers and part of the catering. I was grateful for what they could give, even as I watched them continue to fund Jake's latest entrepreneurial dreams. The wedding was perfect, despite everything. David's family was warm and welcoming, and I started to understand what unconditional family support looked like. His parents asked about my career, celebrated my achievements, and treated me like a person whose opinions and dreams mattered. 2 years later, Jake got engaged to his girlfriend, Emma. They'd been together for about a year, and she was sweet but young, only 21. When Jake announced their engagement, my parents were over the moon. They immediately started talking about wedding plans, guest lists, and venues. Within a week, they'd offered to pay for the entire wedding. They said they wanted to give Jake and Emma the wedding of their dreams, that they'd been saving for this moment. They booked a venue that cost more than David and I had spent on our entire wedding. They hired a wedding planner, paid for engagement photos, and started shopping for Emma's dress. The wedding they planned for Jake cost $18,000. $18,000. I tried to be happy for them. I tried to push down the hurt and the anger and the growing realization that I'd been treated fundamentally differently my entire life. But it was getting harder to ignore. During the wedding planning, I overheard my mom talking to my aunt about how excited she was to finally plan a real wedding, how she'd always dreamed of this moment. When my aunt asked about my wedding, my mom said it was nice but small, that David and I had wanted to keep it simple. That wasn't true. We'd kept it small because we'd had to pay for it ourselves, because the people who should have helped us couldn't afford to, because they were busy funding my brother's endless failures. But the breaking point came 6 months later, when I was 28 and had just received a major promotion at work. I was now a senior manager, making more money than I'd ever imagined, and I'd been selected to lead a high-profile project that could make or break my career. I called my parents to share the news, excited and proud and hoping that maybe this time they'd really celebrate with me. My mom listened politely and said that was nice, then immediately started talking about how worried she was about Jake and Emma's marriage, how they were struggling financially. Jake had quit his latest job after 3 months, saying his boss was unreasonable. Emma was working part-time at a retail store, and they were living in an apartment my parents were helping them afford. My parents were considering giving them money for a down payment on a house, since rent was just throwing money away. I hung up the phone and sat in my apartment, looking around at the life I'd built entirely by myself. I'd bought my own car, paid off my student loans, and was saving for a house. I'd done it all without a single dollar of help from my parents. Meanwhile, Jake had never successfully held a job for more than 6 months, had never lived independently, and had never gone more than a few weeks without needing financial help from our parents. And they were considering buying him a house. That's when I decided to visit them unannounced. I needed to understand what was happening, needed to have an honest conversation about the disparity in how they treated us. I drove to their house on a Saturday morning, planning to sit down and finally address what had been eating at me for years. I let myself in with my spare key, calling out that I was there. No one answered, but I could hear voices in the kitchen. I walked toward the sound, planning to surprise them, when I heard my name. I stopped just outside the kitchen door, hidden from view but able to hear everything clearly. My mom was talking to my dad, and what I heard changed everything. She was saying that they needed to be more careful about how much they spent on Jake, that I was getting suspicious and asking too many questions about family finances. My dad agreed, saying that I'd always been too nosy for my own good. Then my mom said something that made my blood run cold. She said that they'd always known I'd be fine on my own, that I was the type of person who didn't need help, who was strong enough to handle anything. But Jake was different, she said. Jake was sensitive, artistic, someone who needed protection and support. My dad laughed and said that was one way to put it. Then he said something that I will never forget as long as I live. He said that Jake had always been their favorite, that they'd never really connected with me the way they had with him. He said I was too much like my mom's sister, too independent and stubborn, too focused on achievement and success. He said Jake reminded them of themselves when they were young, dreamy, and creative and full of potential. My mom agreed, saying that they'd always felt like Jake needed them more, that he brought out their protective instincts in a way I never had. She said that I'd been so capable from such a young age that they'd never worried about me, never felt like I needed their help. Then came the part that destroyed me. My dad said that they'd actually been relieved when I'd insisted on paying for my own college and wedding, that it had freed up money for Jake's needs. He said they'd been worried about how to split their resources fairly, but I'd solved that problem by being so independent. My mom laughed and said that was the beauty of having a daughter like me. I took care of myself, so they could focus on the child who really needed them. They talked for a few more minutes about Jake's latest business idea, about how they were going to help him get a loan for startup costs. They mentioned that they'd probably need to refinance their house to free up the capital, but that it would be worth it if it finally helped Jake find success. I stood there for probably 10 minutes, listening to them plan Jake's future with the same money they'd never offered me, hearing them laugh about how convenient it was that I didn't need their help. understanding for the first time that my independence hadn't been strength, it had been abandonment. I left without saying hello. I drove home in a daze, trying to process what I'd heard. Everything made sense now. Every time I'd achieved something and received lukewarm congratulations. Every time Jake had failed and received increased support. Every time I'd struggled and been told it was character building while Jake's struggles were met with solutions and resources. I wasn't the strong, independent daughter they were proud of. I was the convenient daughter who didn't cost them anything. For the first time in my life, I let myself feel the full weight of what had been done to me. I let myself acknowledge that I'd been systematically neglected, that my achievements had been dismissed, that my struggles had been ignored. I let myself understand that the people who should have been my biggest supporters had instead been my biggest obstacle. But I also realized something else. I had succeeded despite them, not because of them. I had built a life I was proud of, had developed skills and strength and resilience that no one could take away from me. I had value that existed completely independent of their recognition or support. The next Monday, I called in sick to work and spent the day with a therapist. I told her everything, from my childhood memories of being overlooked to the conversation I'd overheard. She listened without judgment and then said something that changed my perspective entirely. She said that some parents are emotionally incapable of loving their children equally, that they unconsciously choose favorites based on their own needs and insecurities. She said that my parents had likely convinced themselves that they were helping me by not helping me, that they'd used my competence as an excuse to neglect me. But she also said that their failure to parent me properly had inadvertently given me something valuable, the knowledge that I could survive and thrive on my own. She said that many people who are overly supported by their parents struggle to develop real confidence and independence, that they remain dependent and insecure throughout their lives. She was right. Jake, at 26, had never held a job for more than 6 months, had never lived independently, and had never solved a problem without parental intervention. He was married now, but he and Emma were still financially dependent on our parents. He had no real skills, no work ethic, and no understanding of how to navigate the world without someone else's money and support. Meanwhile, I had built a successful career, developed strong relationships, and created a life I was genuinely proud of. I had real confidence because I'd earned it. I had real skills because I'd developed them. I had real strength because I'd been tested and had survived. But I also decided that I was done pretending their treatment of me was acceptable. I was done making excuses for them, done protecting their feelings, done being the convenient daughter who asked for nothing and expected nothing. I wrote them a letter. I told them that I'd overheard their conversation, that I understood now how they really felt about me, and that I was done pretending our relationship was something it wasn't. I told them that I'd succeeded despite their neglect, not because of it, and that I was proud of the life I'd built without their help. I also told them that I was setting boundaries. I would no longer attend family gatherings where Jake's failures were celebrated while my achievements were ignored. I would no longer listen to them complain about money while they continued to fund his lifestyle. I would no longer pretend that their favoritism was acceptable or that their treatment of me had been fair. I told them that if they wanted a relationship with me, they would need to acknowledge what they'd done and make a genuine effort to change. I told them that I wasn't asking for their money or their support, since I'd never had it anyway, but I was asking for basic respect and recognition. I mailed the letter on a Friday and waited. My mom called me that Sunday crying. She said they'd received my letter and were shocked by what I'd written. She said they'd never realized I felt neglected, that they'd thought I preferred being independent. She said they'd always been proud of me, that they'd just expressed it differently than they did with Jake. I told her that I'd heard their actual conversation, that I knew how they really felt, and that I wasn't interested in lies or excuses. I told her that if she wanted to have a relationship with me, she could start by acknowledging the truth instead of trying to rewrite history. She was quiet for a long time, then said that maybe they had made some mistakes, but that they'd always loved me. I told her that love without support, recognition, or investment wasn't really love at all. It was just a word people use to avoid accountability. My dad called me the next day, angry. He said I was being ungrateful and dramatic, that they'd given me everything I needed to succeed. He said that Jake needed more help because he was struggling, and that I should be grateful they'd raised me to be independent. I told him that they hadn't raised me to be independent. They'd abandoned me and called it parenting. I told him that Jake was struggling because they'd never required him to develop any real skills or work ethic, that their help had actually hurt him by making him dependent and entitled. He said that was unfair, that they'd always tried to do what was best for both of us. I told him that the best thing for me would have been parents who celebrated my achievements, supported my dreams, and invested in my future. I told him that the best thing for Jake would have been parents who required him to take responsibility for his choices and develop his own capabilities. He hung up on me. For 3 months, I had no contact with my parents. It was hard, but it was also liberating. I threw myself into my work, strengthened my relationships with people who actually valued me, and continued therapy to process years of accumulated hurt and neglect. During this time, something interesting happened. Jake and Emma's marriage started falling apart. Without my parents' constant financial support, they were struggling to make ends meet. Jake had to get a job, and he was shocked to discover that employers expected him to actually work for his paycheck. He lasted 2 weeks at his first job, 3 weeks at his second, and 1 week at his third. Emma was working full-time and growing resentful of supporting him. My parents were panicking, trying to figure out how to help without admitting that their support had been part of the problem. Meanwhile, I received a promotion that came with a significant salary increase and a leadership role in my company's expansion into new markets. I was featured in a local business magazine as one of the city's rising young executives. I was invited to speak at industry conferences and was offered a position on the board of a nonprofit organization. My life was flourishing in ways I'd never imagined possible. Then Jake called me. He said he was struggling and needed advice, that he didn't know how to handle the pressure of supporting himself and his wife. He said he'd always looked up to me, that he'd always admired my strength and independence. I was amazed. This was the first time he'd ever acknowledged my capabilities, the first time he'd ever asked for my help or advice. I realized that he'd been as damaged by our parents' favoritism as I had been, just in different ways. I met with him and Emma, and we had an honest conversation about our family dynamics. I told him what I'd overheard, how our parents had talked about their favoritism, and how their constant support had actually prevented him from developing the skills he needed to succeed. He was shocked and hurt, but he also seemed relieved. He said he'd always felt pressure to be the favorite, that he'd been afraid to really try because what if he tried his best and still failed? He said it had been easier to accept being seen as the one who needed help than to risk being seen as the one who was genuinely incapable. Emma was angry on both our behalves. She said she'd noticed the disparity in how our parents treated us, that she'd always wondered why they celebrated Jake's failures while barely acknowledging my successes. She said she'd thought it was strange that they'd paid for their wedding while contributing almost nothing to mine. I helped Jake create a realistic budget and job search strategy. I connected him with people in my network who might be able to offer him entry-level positions. I also encouraged him to consider therapy to work through his relationship with our parents and his own sense of identity. Most importantly, I told him that he was capable of more than anyone had ever expected from him, but that he'd need to prove it to himself before anyone else would believe it. 6 months later, Jake had a steady job that he'd held for 4 months. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work that paid the bills. He and Emma were still married and working on their relationship. He was also seeing a therapist and had started setting boundaries with our parents about their financial support. My parents, meanwhile, were struggling with the changes in both their children. They'd lost their role as Jake's rescuers, and my role as the convenient daughter who asked for nothing. They were forced to confront the reality of what their favoritism had done to both of us. My mom called me and asked if we could meet for coffee. She said she'd been thinking about our conversation and wanted to understand how she and my dad had hurt me. She said she'd started therapy of her own and was beginning to see how their treatment of Jake and me had been unfair. I agreed to meet with her, but I made it clear that I wasn't interested in quick fixes or surface-level apologies. I told her that if she wanted to rebuild our relationship, she'd need to do the work to understand what had happened and make genuine changes. During our coffee meeting, she cried. She said she'd read articles about parental favoritism and had recognized patterns in her own behavior. She said she'd realized that she'd used my competence as an excuse to neglect me, that she'd convinced herself that I didn't need support when the truth was that every child needs support. She said she'd also realized that their constant rescue of Jake had prevented him from developing confidence and skills. She said she could see now that they'd hurt both of us, just in different ways. I told her that I appreciated her acknowledgement, but that I'd need to see consistent changes in behavior before I could trust her again. I told her that I was willing to work on rebuilding our relationship, but that it would need to be based on mutual respect and recognition of my worth. She agreed, and we started meeting regularly. Slowly, carefully, we began to reconstruct our relationship on healthier terms. She started asking about my work, celebrating my achievements, and treating me like a person whose opinions and experiences mattered. My dad was slower to come around. He struggled with admitting that he'd been wrong, that his favoritism had hurt me. But eventually, he too began to acknowledge the patterns and work on changing them. It's been 2 years since I overheard that conversation in the kitchen. My relationship with my parents isn't perfect, but it's honest now. They still sometimes slip into old patterns, but they're willing to be called out and to make corrections. They've apologized sincerely for the years of neglect and favoritism. More importantly, they've started treating me like a person whose achievements matter, whose opinions have value, whose presence in their lives is a gift rather than a given. Jake and I have also rebuilt our relationship. He's held the same job for over a year now, has developed genuine work skills, and has started to understand his own worth independent of our parents' support. He's apologized for the role he played in the family dynamics, even though he was largely unconscious of it at the time. But the most important thing I've learned is that my worth was never dependent on their recognition. I am successful, capable, and valuable because of who I am and what I've accomplished, not because of what they did or didn't do for me. I've also learned that sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones who are least capable of seeing your worth. That doesn't mean you're not worthy. It means they're limited in their ability to love well. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in my story, I want you to know that you're not alone. Family favoritism is real, and it's damaging, and it's not your fault. You don't have to accept treatment that diminishes your worth or makes you feel invisible. Your achievements matter, even if the people who should celebrate them don't. Your struggles are valid, even if the people who should support you won't. Your worth exists independent of anyone else's recognition or validation. You have the right to set boundaries with family members who consistently undervalue you. You have the right to expect basic respect and recognition from the people who claim to love you. You have the right to build a life surrounded by people who see your worth and celebrate your successes. And if you're the one who's been favored, if you recognize that you've been given opportunities and support that others in your family haven't received, it's never too late to acknowledge that reality and work to change it. You can use your privilege to advocate for fair treatment of everyone in your family. The journey from being the overlooked child to being a person who knows their worth is not easy. It requires courage to confront painful truths, strength to set difficult boundaries, and wisdom to know the difference between family members who can change and those who can't. But it's worth it. Because once you know your worth, once you understand that you deserved better, once you build a life that reflects your true value, you become unstoppable. You become the person who breaks generational patterns of favoritism and neglect. You become the person who models healthy relationships and boundaries. You become the person who validates others the way you should have been validated. And that, more than any parent's approval or recognition, is a legacy worth building. Have you experienced family favoritism? Have you been the overlooked child or the favored one? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments below, because there's power in knowing we're not alone in these experiences. And if this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these stories and building a community where everyone's worth is recognized and celebrated. Remember, you are worthy of love, support, and recognition. You always have been, even if the people who should have shown you that didn't know how. Your worth is not determined by others' ability to see it. It's determined by the truth of who you are and what you bring to this world. And that truth is beautiful, valuable, and deserving of celebration.